Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I think this is about interview number 400 or so that I've done, so there's a big milestone. And I'm excited to have today a guest, Father Clinton Sensat. So before I get into nuts and bolts issues here with some announcements, I'd like to welcome Father to the show. Without further ado, thank you for joining me today, Father.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honor.
Yes, and I was you were recommended to me by a Facebook friend of mine whose name escapes me now, so my apologies to whoever it is because he's probably watching. So I'm sorry about that. He says you have to have Father Clinton Sensat on. He's great. So I'm glad you're on. But anyway, I did take about a week to 10 days off of podcasting. Those who follow my podcast know that. I had some writing to do for National Catholic Register, more for Catholic World Report coming out. I had an original blog post on hermeneutics that I posted, more on the way with that, and more on the way from the National Catholic Register as well. So I've been busy as well as here on the farm. I've also been fighting off a sinus infection yet again. This is the winter of, and I know, Father, you've been suffering from sinus issues.
Yes, for about 13 years now. So mine's gone on a little bit longer than yours.
Oh well, mine are chronic too. In
Yeah.
fact, I had to have MRIs done and everything starting about 10 years ago. And it was precisely because of my sinus issues. The MRI revealed I had a small benign tumor in my right ear that required some treatment and
Oof.
so on. So, yeah, so you and I were paisanos with sinus issues, but I know a lot of people are suffering from that for this winter, especially. Anyway, Father Sensat is a priest of the Diocese of Lafayette, Louisiana. He is the pastor of Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church in, I believe the name of this, what is it? Erath?
Erath,
Erath?
Erath, Erath.
Erath. And where is that in Louisiana?
Go to the Gulf of Mexico and walk about 10 steps north.
How far east?
So we're due south of Lafayette, and so New Orleans is about 2.5 hours to the east of us. Did you get that? Oh, for heaven's sake. Dr. Chapp, it would seem that you're muted, or one of us is.
I am now unmuted,
There we go.
but I am desperately trying here. Hang on, everyone. Hang on. I'm trying to get this fancy $450 microphone that this is our second try too. So this is very annoying that we're having to go through this. And yeah. So no, okay. I'm going to have to go to my iMac's microphone because for whatever reason, my Shure microphone has cut out on me. Anyway, so Father is also the author of a book, By a Different Way, a Catholic Guide to a Pilgrim's Spirituality. And that was really caught my eye because I've been really very focused of late on the subject, not necessarily my podcast, but on the subject of the spirituality of the pilgrimage. As theologically, I'm drawn more and more to the idea that we as especially as I get old, we as Christians on this planet, on this earth, are sojourners, are pilgrims, and therefore the pilgrimage, which was very big in the early church and into the medieval era and even relatively into the modern era, has fallen on hard times these days, it seems. But I think that needs a retrieval. I did an interview not too long ago with Father John Nepple out in Colorado, who has written a book on hiking in the Colorado mountains, which really was a book on pilgrimage as well. So, first off, what is the sort of gist of your book? I have not had a chance to read it, and what motivated you to write a book on pilgrimage?
So the gist of the book is how to take pilgrimage and make it into a truly spiritual act, right? So it is about pilgrim spirituality in the more general sense of like spoken of in Lumen Gentium, but it's particularly focused on the actual act of pilgrimage and doing it spiritually.
It,
And while I,
Go ahead.
while I
Go ahead.
agree with you that there is a kind of a falling away from pilgrimage in the modern time, it does seem to have been enjoying a rather profound resurgence in contemporary times.
Yeah.
And I've made numerous pilgrimages, led numerous pilgrimages, and the impetus for this was really that most of my pilgrims had no idea what pilgrimage was, how it was different from a vacation, what they could expect, that sort of stuff. So the gist of the book looks at, in particular, the Magi as a kind of controlling metaphor for how to make a good pilgrimage, and the fact that they came, saw Christ, and then left by a different way, and that different way, uh, ambiguously in the Greek, seems to also imply that they themselves were different after their journey.
Oh,
Not just they just took different path.
that's very interesting. Yeah, I've never heard that before. That the Greek implies that they themselves were different, not just that they went a different way.
Yes.
No, that's fascinating. So what then is the essence of a pilgrim? What makes what the Magi did? What made that into a pilgrimage? Beyond just the fact that okay, they had a certain faith that a king was born somewhere.
Hmm. So I think the fact, one, that it's a holy journey. They weren't going for purposes of getting away from their busy life. They weren't going away for purposes of reflection, and they weren't going just to sightsee. They were going deliberately to venerate, led by call by God, and to offer worship, right?
Yeah,
So one of the things that I argue is that a great way to see if you're making pilgrimage is not from so much from the externals of where you go as it is what is your intention in going. And one of my major arguments or distinctions is between pilgrimage and tourism. And I get
yeah,
down there into the etymology that a tour etymologically is related to a circle, a turn. So you go, you see, you come back. A pilgrimage etymologically is through the fields, that it's a straight line, that you should not be the same when you return. It is a journey of progress. So it's not just returning after taking some pictures, but that you yourself are different when you return.
that's very interesting. That sense of being different upon the return. And that there's a kind of linear nature to the spirituality of the pilgrimage. There's a goal, there's a destination, and you probably even have this sort of faint, vague hope that the journey itself and then arriving at the destination will change you.
Yes,
That has to be part of your intentionality, right? I'm engaging in this precisely because I want to be changed, and for a Christian specifically. I want to be changed into the mind of Christ. That's got to be the primary motive, right?
absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that I point out is that Christ himself was a pilgrim on Passover, and it was through his pilgrimage that he saved the world, right? It was his
Yeah,
pilgrimage that took him to Jerusalem, and as a pilgrim, he saved the world. So he himself changed things as a pilgrim, and he himself wants to change us as pilgrims.
very good. I remember the first time I was in Rome for any length of time was 2008, and I was there with my students from DeSales University. I was just the faculty mentor, chaperone, whatever, for a semester abroad. And I actually was very reluctant to go there. I didn't want to spend a semester away from home from my wife, who was very gracious and let me go. She's probably happy. Good riddance. Larry's out of the house now. She was very she actually came over to visit some as well. But I wasn't really happy about it. And then when I was there, I started doing touristy things, like, oh, I better go see the Colosseum. I better go see, Piazza Navona and all this kind of. But after I was there about a month and a half, that started to get very old. And it struck me suddenly one day. I was wandering around Piazza Navona feeling sorry for myself, and I wandered into this church and it happened to be the Church of St. Augustine. and I saw that there was the tomb of somebody in the back of the
Hmm.
church. And listeners to my blog understand, have heard this story before. And I walked back to the back of the church to see whose tomb it was, and it was the tomb of Saint Monica,
Yeah.
his mother. And at that moment, it struck me. I got down on my knees and started to pray very intensely because it struck me that the city that I'm in right now is unlike any other. I thought to myself, what kind of place is this where you just wander into a random church and there is the darn mother of Saint Augustine in a tomb there in this church without any fanfare, without any publicity? Oh, there's St. Monica's tomb. And I resolved then and there that I was going to make the rest of my time in Rome into a pilgrimage, that it was no longer, and and I was intending then to be transformed, to be changed, and I didn't want to spend the next month and a half in Rome feeling sorry for myself, feeling miserable. When can I go home? I wanted it to be transformative. And so I started visiting all the station churches and deliberately viewing each one as a spiritual destination. And then I went to other churches and other holy sites in Rome. And to say that I was a changed person when all that was over is a tremendous understatement. I didn't really think to myself, "This is a pilgrimage" at the time, but that's in fact what it was. It would be great if everybody had that wonderful opportunity that I had to be in Rome.
Yeah. And I think you hit the nail right on the head that a lot of people discover a pilgrim spirituality by starting off by being skeptical of the whole idea,
Yeah,
and then and then there's an effect that takes place in their life. I was a pilgrim skeptic at first. I talk about this in the book, that I, by both training and temperament, thought that the whole idea was ridiculous until I made some and then saw the effect that it had in my life. One of the things I want to be clear about, because this is a common misconception that I try to address in the book also, is that pilgrimage doesn't have to be a big overseas journey, right? That you
right.
can make a pilgrimage to your local cathedral if that's your intention,
Yes.
right? So it can sometimes seem like the spirituality of the bourgeoisie, and it's not that.
Oh, yeah. I knew former students at DeSales University who were from Philadelphia who, over the Christmas holidays or over Holy Week, would do what they call a church hop, where they would just go. It was a pilgrimage from one shrine to another in Philadelphia, ending up at the cathedral. And it was very moving, very spiritual for them. So yeah, absolutely. You don't have to go to Rome. You don't have to go do the Camino in Spain. You can do a church hop in your own diocese. Or even just go to a specific church in your diocese. And I think a lot of dioceses too, and I often say this to my wife, I'm talking too much, I should let you, but
You're
this
fine.
this topic just interests me so much. I'm a big fan, and I think now you're kind of articulating why. I'm a huge fan of this isn't even working. I don't know why I'm talking into it. I'm a huge fan of shrines. And when I lived in Lehigh Valley, there right about a half an hour from us was the National Shrine of Our Lady of Czestochowa, run by the Pauline Fathers, Polish order. I used to call it Polish Catholic Disney World because you go down there. But I would make special pilgrim. They have relics there of various Polish saints and so on. I would absolutely make pilgrims to this day, even though I'm now 2 hours away. I occasionally make a pilgrimage down to that. Near me in Scranton, Pennsylvania, is the National Shrine of Our Lady, a National Shrine to Saint Anne, run by Passionist priests, and I will frequently go there. There's something about a shrine that attracts pilgrims that creates an entirely different kind of ethos, it seems to me, than even a regular sort of parish that might have pilgrimage elements to it. Don't you think?
Yes. And one of the things that I say in the book, one of the things that I argue is that this is founded on the economy of the incarnation. That, God takes certain physical places and shows his power in them in a special way, just as he manifested it in his flesh. And yeah, the idea of a shrine is exactly that, that this is certainly God is everywhere, but that we're denoting that God has acted here in a special way. And so we make a physical journey to go encounter him there.
Yeah. I mean, you go to the Shrine of St. Anne, and I went to actually school, seminary at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and right next to the
So did
mount
I.
is, oh, you did?
Yeah,
Oh my goodness, what year did you graduate?
2009.
Oh, I got out of there in '86. See, I'm an old fart, and you're still a youngin. So you are a Mountie. I had no idea. I should have done better research. So you know what I'm going to say. You know, the shrine
Yes.
to Elizabeth Ann Seton is right there. There's also the shrine, above the mount,
Hmm.
the Lourdes Grotto. That is a huge pilgrimage destination, and you see buses and buses going up there, right?
Yeah.
Uh, there's but I wonder to what extent now pilgrimages like that have fallen on hard times. I mentioned the St. Anne Shrine, and if you go there on the walls, they have pictures of various major events from like the 40s and the 50s. And you see as far as the eye can see on the grounds just thousands of people attending like the culminating day of the novena to Saint Anne or some other celebration novena Saint Anne, and thousands of people are there, and then you see all these buses in the background, old-fashioned buses, all right, and ladies are all dressed up and men are in suit and tie and they're all there sitting on the ground on blankets and whatnot, and I'm thinking, does that still happen to that scale? And have pilgrimages kind of in that sense fallen on hard times these days?
That's a good question. I would like to look at it in two different ways. One, when I was at the Mount, which was, as you say, a few years after you, there were still large pilgrimages going to the Shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes up there on the mountain. Busloads still coming. When I visited the Shrine of the North American Martyrs in Ontario,
Yeah,
they have pictures and accounts of the large busloads of pilgrims that come there. But I would think that two things mitigate against kind of the numbers that we saw maybe in the 40s or the 50s. One is that any kind of actual concrete devotional practice draws fewer numbers now than it did in the past.
yeah.
I think that that's pretty clear. But also the ease with which somebody can get to the Holy Land or to Lourdes or to Fatima or to Rome has increased. So I think of, I studied at the Dominican House of Studies for my licentiate, and I think of the Holy Land Franciscan Monastery there, which was explicitly built because it was so difficult to get to the Holy Land. And then 20 years later, it wasn't that difficult to get to the Holy Land, relatively speaking.
It's even run
So,
by the same Franciscans, right?
right. So, if you're going to say, if I'm going to go on pilgrimage from Louisiana, am I going to go to Washington, D.C. to the replica, or am I going to go to Jerusalem? Uh, Probably going to go to Jerusalem. And so I think that might be part of it too, that our
Yeah.
greater facility with travel makes some American shrines less attractive than they have been in the past.
That's a very interesting point that I didn't consider because yeah, when I go to Rome, I'm just amazed at how many people are there, and I realize too that the only way I'm able to go to Rome is that somebody else is paying for me to go to Rome, usually through my writing when I'm there. And I'm thinking, where do all these people get the money to go to Rome? But then you really think about it, and you think, well, plane fare is not as expensive as it used to be, and there are B and B's everywhere, and so yeah, so yeah, I think that's probably a very good explanation as to why you don't see maybe perhaps the numbers that I saw before. At things like in the photos of the St. Anne Shrine and so forth. But I do know, like in talking to my really old Catholic relatives, most of them are deceased now, but when I was younger and talking to my older Catholic relatives, Italian and Poles, that is, I'm Italian and Polish, uh, it just seemed to me they would always talk about Well, we're going on they wouldn't necessarily always call it a pilgrimage, but some would. We're going on a trip, we're going on a pilgrimage to see this church or that church. And you really don't see that anymore. And my worry would be that those Catholics, for example, who are going to Rome or someplace like that, are going there more for touristy reasons than pilgrimage reasons, right?
That's why I read the book.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I agree with that. Again, I think it's cultural difference. We live online much more than former generations did because they didn't have anything online. Um, I'm 43, and one of the things we joke about is our grandparents would just show up at each other's houses for coffee. And if somebody knocks on my door, I act like it's the coming apocalypse. Like, why are you here? Why didn't you text first? Why didn't you call?
Yeah.
So that sort of physical visit to places, I think, is a cultural phenomenon across the board, is different than it's been in the past. And we have to keep that in mind. But I think, yeah, I would definitely say that most people tend to view pilgrimage as tourism to holy places rather than a holy journey in and of itself.
Yeah, that's a very interesting distinction, and I think that's true. It's like going as a tourist to a holy place to kind of check it out, and you might even have in the back of your brain some hope that maybe something spiritual will happen when I'm there. But you don't really think of it as a pilgrimage. It's like I'm going to see as a tourist but then, something happens. And, I went to Rome for the first time, not even as a tourist, just as a disgruntled faculty member, forced to go abroad, but ended up sort of changed,
Yeah,
changed by the experience. But where I'm leading up to this, Father, which is kind of what I wanted to drive home, is that in order for something to be a pilgrimage and not just a tourist trip abroad or even someplace here, it seems to me that there has to be an ascetical element as well, a penitential element where, okay, I'm going on pilgrimage, and in order to get all the sort of benefit, to put it bluntly, from this pilgrimage that I'm seeking, all the spiritual transformation I'm seeking, I have to prepare the soil. All right. I can't view this as I'm going to go see this holy saints relics on this day in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'm going to go and get drunk at a restaurant and pig out on the local food and that kind of thing. It doesn't work that way. It seems to me there's got to be this penitential aspect.
sure. It's one of the things that I talk about that pilgrimage is always kissed by the cross. And I've noticed that in my own life, that when I'm on vacation and it feels like the Lord is telling me to go on vacation, things go smoothly. And when I'm on pilgrimage, inevitably they don't. That there's always some element of passive purification as well as active purification. And I do talk about how we need to fast, how we need to um, do it both do penance as a preparation for pilgrimage and view the pilgrimage itself to some degree as a penitential act. Um, and I think this goes back to the idea of the pilgrim people in the desert living on manna and quail, the whole idea of what is really the pilgrimage of Lent in preparation for Easter.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that this is absolutely something that always bears the image of penance. But I want to also, you have to understand, I promote pilgrimage too. So I can't go around telling everybody the whole purpose of this is to suffer, pay $5,000 now. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so,
No,
you know,
suffering's not the goal. Suffering's not the goal.
right.
But the point to all ascetical discipline, I mean, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I mean, the purpose of all ascetical discipline isn't suffering as such, but the chastening of the soul so that the dross is burned off, the things that divert our attention from ultimacy to penultimacy are cut away, we're pruned, so that our eyes can be opened to the joy of the Lord, to the joy that awaits us, uh, kind of like an athlete preparing for the Super Bowl or a major race at the Olympics. It's the pain of the training isn't the point. The point is I am now prepared to achieve something really grand in my life. In this case, though, with the help of grace, obviously. And I get your point. You know, you're running pilgrimages. You don't want to say, come along here, you got 5 grand, we're going to Fatima, and boy, are you going to suffer when you're
Right.
over there. It's kind of not the point. Uh, but and it's also that, yeah, I suppose I'm being maybe a little hung. I suppose it's possible to combine some elements of pilgrimage and some elements of things that you would describe as more touristy. I don't want to be down on tourism.
Right. And I think that it's, in fact, it can be important, especially for pilgrims who haven't engaged in a lot of spiritual discipline in their life, to say, for example, yeah, we're going to be really focused till about 6 p.m. And then at 6 p.m., you can relax and therefore be spiritually ready for tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. I think that that's a helpful um, discipline that I had to learn because as a pilgrim leader, I was more intense in the early days. And the reality is that it just means that most pilgrims can't get any spiritual benefit after day three.
Oh, that's an interesting insight because you're kind of burned out at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. And also, part of the pilgrimage experience wouldn't just be going to holy sites. It's also about, in some ways, experiencing and enjoying the culture, including the food and so forth, that those holy martyrs and saints and former people helped to create. In other words,
Yeah.
there's a reason why Italians live la dolce vita, and it's directly related to their Catholicism and their history with the Catholic Church. So yeah, there can be deep connections between the holy aspects of penance and pilgrimage, and then embracing the local culture and enjoying what it has to offer.
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in Vico's philosophy of God creating culture as kind of part of his providence, and that the engine of culture is there to reveal something of the natural law and of what humans are called to be. And I absolutely have come to love culture, just like art, just like literature, just like nature, as a contemplative experience. That I see God at work in the culture that's different from mine, and therefore I can see his fingerprints more readily than I can see it in my own.
That's really interesting. Again, you're opening my eyes to a lot of things because then the pilgrim a holy pilgrimage might have then gradations of what we're talking about here. There could be something explicitly ecclesial Christian. I'm going to go visit the tomb of Saint Peter or whatever. But I do recall, once again being in Rome, that I would go out of my way to visit a church that I knew had, oh, that's got a beautiful Raphael in it. Oh, that's got a
Hmm.
beautiful Caravaggio. You got to go over there. That's the church that has the Caravaggios. And it wasn't necessarily a specifically religious pilgrimage, but it was a kind of artistic pilgrimage.
Yeah.
And it's possible then to go and see various gorgeous, like Renaissance and Baroque sites in places like Rome, Paris, other places. And so, but that is actually a kind of spiritual pilgrimage insofar as these are incarnational things.
Yeah. So if you integrate it, right? I'm a big
Yeah.
fan of Saint Bonaventure, and all of his stuff is about how everything ultimately points back to the Word. And so if you can have that integrative mindset of yes, this art, yes, this pasta, yes, this mountain, yes, this bird is in fact a stepping stone and a sign of God's presence, then yeah, that enriches the experience. Um, we we don't have to get into the details of this, but the Holy Grail in Valencia is, pretty good claimant to be the cup of Christ. We went to visit it on pilgrimage this past November, and one of the things that I did was I read from Tennyson's Quest for the Holy Grail in the Idols of the King on the
Yeah.
bus on the drive there, and I really think that people appreciated that profoundly. This cultural resonance of really the ultimate literary quest, the ultimate literary pilgrimage of looking for the Holy Grail, and there we were concretely doing it. So the literary aspect deepened their contemplative appreciation of the journey we were making.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that shows how various levels of culture and specifically religious things can be deeply integrated in all of these things. I've never really read up on the Holy Grail in Spain. I've seen pictures of it, and that people say, yeah, there's some good reasons for thinking this is the Holy Grail. But you seem, and you said you don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I think that's interesting. I think my listeners would like to hear why you think that could very well be the Holy Grail.
Well, this is what I tell my pilgrims. You know, there are very few things that I make pilgrimage to that have as much support as the sacred chalice of Valencia. It has scientific support that this is from 1900, 2000 years ago. It has art historical, archaeological support that this is it. It has a compelling historical narrative of how it got from Jerusalem to Valencia. Basically, St. Mark gave it to Peter. This is why the Roman canon is the only one to say this sacred chalice as opposed to a sacred chalice. And that Lawrence, who is from Huesca, Spain, smuggled it out whenever he had to gather the treasures of the Church of Rome, and that it was in Huesca, Spain, then moved to the Pyrenees during the Muslim invasions. This is where we got the idea that the Grail was lost, and people, crusading knights, would go searching for it through the Pyrenees mountains because it was moved by night from monastery to monastery. And there are actually frescoes on these monastery walls that represent when they held the Grail. A picture of the Virgin Mary with a glowing cup in her hand, and then it was given by the monasteries to King Martin the Humane of the Crown of Aragon. And then when he died, it was given to the Cathedral of Valencia, and it's been there ever since. So there's good documentary evidence, there's good archaeological evidence, there's good art historical evidence, and the simple reality is I've been twice, and both times my spirituality seemed to really pop and show me that this was, in fact, the chalice. Now, it's only the little cup on top. The stem
Yeah,
and the
all
base and everything was
right.
added later. Yeah.
Added later. But I would think as a priest who says mass, that would be especially moving for you as a man who holds in his hands the chalice with our Lord's blood on
Yeah.
a daily basis. That
It really was. So the first time I went, I didn't say mass there. I just attended. But when I went with my pilgrims, they actually let us do a mass in the presence of the Grail on Thanksgiving Day. And so the correlation of
wow.
Eucharist and Thanksgiving, I am not given to crying. And during the consecration of the blood, I was broken down in sobs. And the deacon had to help me back up because it was that powerful to recognize that, yes, this is the sacrifice that I hold in my hand. And it's the same sacrifice that he instituted 2,000 years ago with the cup behind my head.
And see, and this is the beauty of the pilgrimage. I mean, it transforms you in these powerful, powerful ways. And also opens you up to realities that you didn't like. I've heard of like the chalice that you're talking about, the Holy Grail you're talking about, but I didn't really spend much time on it. But if you go on pilgrimage with somebody like you who knows what you're talking about, it can be a powerfully uplifting experience. And if you want to use it this way, in an educational way, it educates you spiritually as to the great riches of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that my pilgrims tell me is they come to know the saints on a personal level, not just as somebody they read about, but as somebody they now can have a relationship with. They get a deeper sense of why the resurrection of the dead is important. You know, when you're visiting the relics of Saint Monica, and you
Yeah,
get a real sense that she's there,
yeah.
right? Like, you know, that there's some real presence here, and like, oh my goodness, she's going to rise from the dead, and hopefully I'm going to spend eternity getting to know her better. You know, this kind of
Yeah.
friendship that starts on earth. I use this image a lot. It's like going to visit a friend's house so that you can get to know him better. That's one thing that pilgrimage does.
Yeah, that's interesting. You point that out about spending eternity getting to know Saint Monica better. Even as a young seminarian and budding theologian, I've always been an enormous fan of Saint Augustine and his theology and his life story, and a voracious reader of Augustine's writings. And I was always mesmerized by the figure of his mother, of Saint Monica, and the role that she played in through prayer, essentially in his conversion. And that's why, when I just stumbled by happenstance,
Hmm.
upon her tomb, that's why it was specifically moving to me. I saw the hand of divine providence in guiding me there to say, this is the kind of special place that you're in. Now pay attention to where you are.
Right.
And stop complaining, for crying out loud, chap. You're in Rome, right? Quit your belly aching. Uh, those who know me know I'm a complainer. But, a different relic to go along with what you're talking about, the Holy Grail, that I've always believed is authentic and genuine. I'd love to do a whole podcast on it with somebody who's an expert. Is the Shroud of Turin.
Hmm.
And I've never been to Turin, Italy, and I would love to go and see, where the Shroud of Turin is housed. I don't know if it's on permanent display now. I don't think it is.
No,
I know they put it in the glass with the inert, like argon gases on the inside to help preserve it. Have you seen the Shroud of Turin, or
I have
been to
not.
Turin?
I have
Yeah.
not. And in fact, I was don't hate me, I was a shroud denier until this last pilgrimage. One of the intriguing things that happened on this last pilgrimage was uh, um, in one of the churches we went into in Barcelona, there was a whole shroud display. And I wasn't all that interested in it, but my pilgrims wanted to go. And I discovered a number of interesting things, like this Romanian illuminated manuscript that seems to depict the shroud 200 years before it becomes public knowledge in France.
Yes.
And that sort of stuff, caused me to drop some of my skepticism. Now, theoretically, I have a pilgrimage scheduled to go to Italy. I've actually never been to Rome, but I'm going
Wow.
this. I know, but I'm going supposedly this summer if the pilgrimage makes, and we are going to Turin because it's for the um, canonization of Pier Giorgio Frassati. So I haven't heard anything about whether the shroud will be exposed during the Jubilee year, especially for his canonization. I would hope that it is, but one way or the other, I hope to
Yeah.
find out more about it and learn more when I'm there in Turin.
Yeah, I hope you do, because I've done a lot of research on the Shroud, and there is just, like you with the Holy Grail, there is just a mountain of evidence uh, it has a serious claim to truly
Yeah,
being the burial claim of Jesus of Nazareth, not the least of which they still have no idea how the image was formed.
right.
And a lot of doubt has been cast on the radiocarbon dating for a lot of reasons, and other dating methods have now come forward through spectrographic analysis, linen analysis to date it to the first century. Uh, Pollen grains all over it from the Middle East, as well as every place according to where art historians claim it's been. And that's the other piece of it, as you've already sort of mentioned it, that art historians are able to, in a sense, show how the iconography of the face of Jesus changes abruptly, beginning in about the fourth or fifth century. I can't remember which. That before then, Jesus is in iconography is depicted as youthful, even with short hair, as an Apollo-like figure almost. And you see this actually in some catacombs. But then when the image of Edessa comes forward, all right, which was probably the folded up shroud with just the face showing. All of a sudden, the iconography changes, and all across Byzantium and in the West, all across that region, iconography changes to imitate that. Now, maybe that was a forgery, but it is interesting to see how art historians can trace it right
Right.
down to some of the holes. But anyway, this isn't a show about the shroud, a show about the shroud, but to point out that I think that would be a very important, for me personally, pilgrimage to go on. I think it would be uh, very uplifting for me to
Yeah,
go.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, are you familiar with the historian Carolyn Walker Bynum? I think that's how you pronounce her name.
No, I am not.
She's a secular historian, but she writes about the Middle Ages. And she wrote one book that really moved me a long time ago in my priesthood changed my perspective on some of these things. It's called Christian Materiality. And it's just a historical examination of the late Middle Ages and how they approached sacred stuff. And
Yeah.
so much of our modern spirituality is kind of a rejection of the material, of the physical. And I really appreciated that witness and as part of our tradition that no, there really was a time and it really was a genuine spirituality. It wasn't superstitious. That was an appreciation of sacred stuff. And I think it is founded on the incarnation, right? This idea of God becoming flesh. And so I'm a big fan now in promoting that idea in pilgrimage, like whether it's the Shroud, whether it's the Holy
Yes.
Grail, whether it's the relics,
Yes.
there's sacred stuff out there.
Sacred.
And
I
this is
like that.
important.
I love that. I might title a whole blog post on that and give you
Huh.
attribution. Yeah, Father Sensat and sacred stuff. I know my wife, and my wife wouldn't mind me sharing this. She has a PhD in theology as well. She teaches, she's the dean at St. Charles Seminary in Philadelphia, one of the deans. Anyway, she went to Notre Dame University of, and she did a semester abroad in Rome. I hate to keep talking about Rome, but she was raised Catholic, but wasn't a particularly profoundly, in other words, on fire for the Lord. Let's put it that way. And her major at Notre Dame was a double major in English and Italian, so she wasn't even taking a bunch of theology classes. But was to talk about sacred stuff. It was her visit to Rome where she encountered like the tomb of Saint Peter, the tomb of Saint Paul,
Right.
the tomb of various, Saint John Chrysostom and Monica, and so where she realized what you're just talking, what you just that's what brought it up in my sacred stuff that these were real people who really lived, that these events happened in historical time and were witnessed by historical people who left behind historical records and their own bodies and other artifacts and so on. And it's still there for us to in a sense, take in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's helpful, you know? I don't know how else to say it than that. You can't say that it's necessary for salvation, of course, but the reality is that if you make a good pilgrimage, it's really helpful. You know, it's a
Yeah,
support to the spiritual life.
yeah. As in my wife's case and in my case, it's, I guess we could coin a new phrase. It's called the accidental pilgrimage, where you go someplace for reasons other than pilgrimage, but the place itself, the stuff that's there, overwhelms you with its almost sacramental, epiphanic quality of
Yeah.
communicating the divine to you. And then all of a sudden, you find yourself transformed and you realize, unbeknownst to me, I've been on a pilgrimage here.
Right. And I'm a big believer in Thomas's idea that God is everywhere by his essence, power, and presence, and that it's his power that admits of degrees, right? His action in the physical world that admits of degrees. So it's not different, or at least not generically different, from Moses going up to see the burning bush and
Yeah,
encountering God, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
here's a
exactly.
manifestation of God's power. God is everywhere, but God is manifesting his power here. And I encounter him and I spiritually remove the shoes from my feet because the place where I stand is holy ground.
Absolutely. And I think that's what draws people then, not just on pilgrimage today to things that happened long ago, uh, but also because they're drawn to pilgrimage sites where miraculous supernatural events are alleged to be happening now. Now, here we require, and I wanted to ask you about this before, I was thinking about this before we went on air. What criteria can, obviously, we'd have to borrow from what it is that the church lays down for us. We need to adjudicate, right, very carefully between claimed spiritual realities happening now that are false and misleading, and those which might be actually genuine. I guess I would say we should always maybe wait until the church grants its approval, but then I think no, part of the church's approval is based on, is there a natural kind of veneration which has arisen here on its own? So,
Yeah. So I'll say two things to that. One, I'm a strong believer in a vocation to pilgrimage, not that it needs to be overly discerned, but that like all graces, God apportions particular graces to each of us. And if I feel the inner impulse to go to some place like, say, a Medjugorje, and it's based on an actual spiritual discernment to some degree, then yeah, I should go. I mean, it seems to me that you should always do God's will, even even if it doesn't not clear as to exactly all the details of it. But the second thing, Larry, that I say all the time to my pilgrims, and I do tend to focus on the things that are more historical rather than currently
Right.
happening, is it doesn't have to be yes or no. There can be a sliding scale here. Like, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is the reality. Probably sure, maybe sure, pretty sure it's not, and then
Yeah.
absolutely not. And I think that sliding scale of probability, which has to be taken into account anytime you go to an actual concrete place claiming something, um, gives you, God bless you, gives
Thank you.
you a real sense of, all right, I am praying, I am venerating, I am doing this as an act of spirituality, but it's not an act of credulity, right? There is a difference between faith and credulity. And so to just say, Lord, if this isn't the saint that I think it is, I just hope that
Yeah.
do this anyway. Now, I will also say that normally I tend to be a little skeptical, which is odd for somebody who leads pilgrimages to places like the Holy Grail. And there are times when, I think even if the thing isn't real, God's power can still be at work.
Yes.
So let me offer you an example without going too deeply personal. They have the Basilica of the Pillar there in Zaragoza, which is supposedly based on an apparition of Our Lady while she was still alive to St. James, preaching in Zaragoza, and angels dropped off a pillar, and supposedly it's still the same pillar there today in the basilica. Um, I have my doubts. Uh, okay, and I'm just going to be honest with you. I have my doubts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but when I went and venerated the pillar, it was a powerful spiritual experience. And one of the reasons it was a powerful spiritual experience is because you get to go around back, and there's a little window there that you can actually touch the stone. And you kneel on stone steps to kiss the stone, and the stone steps were worn away by the
Yeah.
knees of centuries of pilgrims, and the pillar itself was worn away by centuries of pilgrims kissing it. So that even if this isn't exactly the pillar, if there ever was a pillar or ever an apparition, nevertheless, Our Lady's presence has been made known there. God's power has been made known there. And I think that, when you get to something a little bit more complicated that I do not want to wade into, because I know people are very divided on this, something like Medjugorje,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
look at the the ruling of Rome was basically whatever's happening with the apparitions, something's happening at the shrine,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind too, that devotion itself makes a place sacred. So that, and I'm not saying that that shouldn't matter, authenticity shouldn't matter, it does and it should. But even if something is inauthentic, nevertheless the centuries of devotions have sanctified the ground.
I agree completely. I'm a Medjugorje skeptic. To the extent I kind of agree, like we don't want to get way too far into this, that maybe something did happen there supernaturally with the young children initially, but then eventually got turned into something else. Nevertheless, I know people there, including my mother-in-law, my wife's mother, went on a pilgrimage there, an honest to God pilgrimage to Medjugorje, and she went there realizing, well, there might be certain fraudulent aspects, but she was overwhelmed, just as you just mentioned, with the spirituality of those who were there, with the manifest faith of everyone that was there, by the transformative experience, the lines and lines and lines of people waiting to go to confession, for example,
Right.
are unbelievable. Furthermore, I think one has to look at what message is being communicated. And like you mentioned, the pillar, whether or not really is the pillar, the message being communicated is something beautiful, really. That, and I think of like Our Lady's house at Loreto. Is that
Right.
really her house? I don't know, but beautiful things happen there. Same with Medjugorje. There's nothing in the message or the messages, the 10 million messages that a very chatty Mary has left behind that are in any way controversial. Right? It's like pray, do penance, oh my dear children, our Lord loves you. Oh my dear children, do more penance. I mean, okay, fine, it gets a bit repetitious, but we need to be reminded to do all those things. So I see great value in those places, even if they haven't been, in a sense, proven or unproven.
Yeah. One of my favorite kind of pilgrim humorous stories is about St. Peter Rates in Braga. So, supposedly ordained by St. James himself, the first apostle of Braga, Portugal, a monk, 1600 years later, was led by a vision of a star to the sands where Peter Braga was buried, unearthed Peter Braga's relics, brought them into the church. Everyone venerated them, and a forensic anthropologist examined them and said, "Yeah, that's the bones of an 11-year-old girl." So
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah,
and yet they're still on display there in Braga. And it's,
yeah,
okay, does that mean that all the devotion, whether Peter Rates was a real person or not, all the devotion to the apostolic faith, the apostolic founding of the church in Portugal, does that not matter just because somebody made a mistake about which bones were where?
yeah,
You know?
yeah, exactly. And so the mere fact that people have enough faith that they want to do a pilgrimage to the spot, uh, where others have done the same in order to show their devotion to the apostolic origins of the faith in Spain, then or and Portugal and every place else. Yeah, I think those are great manifestations. I want to come back to because I think it's so very important because that's what spurred this whole conversation about grails and shrouds and holy houses and pillars and whatnot. The whole thing about the historical stuff is that I do believe that this incarnational aspect of our faith has been kind of diminished, has been kind of lost of late. And it's almost as if, and you can speak to this because you're of a younger generation, but I know priests of my generation were almost embarrassed by all of this stuff.
Sure.
That, oh no, the message of the gospel is to love thy neighbor as thyself and the Lord your God, and therefore social justice and works of mercy and all that's true. All of that is
Right.
true. But then what happens is the message of the faith gets reduced to an almost Kantian level of moralism, where all Christianity is a philanthropic praxis that I can live with or without Christ. And I'm not the first person to point this out that
Right. Sure.
you reduce Christianity to an NGO of the United Nations or simply a praxis of feel good, do goodism, then you denude it of its specific weight, and it eventually becomes boring. And this is one of the reasons why people walk away from it. Uh, and yet, I remember from my youth, and I'll turn it over to you for a comment. I'd go to these various parishes that were kind of bored and beige and everything else in between with the typical kind of 70s pastor, Father Skippy Toes, preaching a message of it's nice to be nice to the nice and all this kind of stuff. And I remember that all of a sudden there was an Orthodox church down the street from us that claimed to have an icon that was exuding fragrant oil and so on, a miraculous icon.
Right.
The lines to get into that place were out the door. And I remember a priest, telling no, no, don't go over there. That's superstition. Our faith
Sure.
isn't about that. The whole bit. Like we can't focus on miracles. And that people wanted to be fed spiritually by something more, by stuff, by something more immediate. And anyway, that's my thought that we need to resurrect, not necessarily exuding icons, but you get my point.
Sure. I'd like to say three things to that as quickly as I can. One is that I think the dialectic of this got started in the Renaissance with the recovery of Platonism. And both in Catholicism and in the Protestant Reformation, there
Yes.
was an attack on sacred stuff because true spirituality was never material,
Yeah.
right? And that's been with us since that time. We priests, and even never mind. I'm not going to mention that. We priests make fun of the fact that the current book of blessings never blesses things. It only blesses the people who use them. And that's why most of us, even if we're not of a traditionalist bent, will use the older book of blessings because it actually blesses the stuff,
Yeah.
right? And so this idea of that sacred stuff is gone in the post Vatican II, not mindset, but kind of the rapprochement that tried to happen after there. And I think that that's wrong. But three, I'll also mention my own particular conversion on this. That as a young priest, I was very intellectual and kind of focused on what's in the mind, what's in the will, as many of us do, that emotion and senses are just unimportant. And then I realized it doesn't work. That if you have a parish that's based entirely on the intellectual and the moral, people don't convert. But that we're, as
Yeah.
human beings, we're actually fed at a sub-intellectual level, right? And as somebody who now has a degree in rhetoric, I get that you use all the available means of persuasion. And we're moved by our senses. We're moved by our imagination. We're moved by our emotions. This is all very important. And because we're moved by all that, Christ, in fact, reaches into that, right? Christ saves us in that. This is the whole sacramental order. And I don't think it's for nothing that people who got rid of all the sacred stuff also had a rather dim view of the sacraments.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because there's almost a quasi-Gnostic element here that it's all about inner transformation, inner enlightenment, and has very little to do with all of these outward things. It's funny you mentioned about the Book of Blessings. I remember once I had a rosary and I brought it to a priest. This was in the 80s to be blessed. And the priest is okay, and I hold the rosary in my hand, and he blesses me and says, "Lord, may you bless Larry as he prays this holy rosary and blah blah blah." I don't know what the exact words were, but he was blessing me and my use of the rosary, and he wasn't blessing the rosary itself. And I was a seminarian at the time, and I thought, this is a bit strange. So I went to one of my seminary profs. He goes, yeah. All right, here, let me. And he blessed the rosary. He actually blessed the rosary. He goes, I understand what you're talking about and I understand what they're driving at. But this is so true. And I also think that it's interesting that you bring up the fact that the Renaissance actually, not a lot of people know this. It represented a kind of anti-Aristotelian movement, and there was this resurrection, if you want to pardon the pun, of Plato. I mean, scientists like Bruno were darn near sun worshippers because of how central the sun was and so forth in Platonic imagery. And that Platonism really did have an effect in the Enlightenment and on through,
Yeah,
to the extent that not just in terms of materiality, but also in terms of historicity. You had an Enlightenment thinker like Gotthold Lessing. It's called Lessing's Ditch, where he talks about the contingent truths of history cannot be the vessels of the immutable truths of reason and so on, because history is contingent and changeable and
right.
malleable. And this is what we're contending with. And yet, and that's my point, where the sort of beige Catholicism that Barron talks about all the time, Robert Barron, is unattractive, because ultimately at the heart of the Christian claim is a supernatural claim. Christ was the incarnate God who was crucified and then rose from the dead. All
Hmm.
right, and that is the set. If that is true, it's the most unbelievable truth in the history of the human race. All right.
So some years ago, I'm not going to name names, but there was a famous cardinal on CBS on Easter morning, and he was asked what the message of Easter was. And he said that the message of Easter is that God can bring light out of darkness, hope out of despair, life out of death. And I was there is in between my masses, and I was screaming loudly at the television, no, the message of Easter is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Like, can we
Yes.
can we not take this and make it into kind of an amorphous universal hallmark message, but
Yeah.
actually deal with the concrete historical fact that our Lord rose from the dead? You had one of the biggest pulpits of your life, and you didn't even mention the name Jesus Christ. And
Yeah.
that really frustrated me, that it is so easy, and I know it as a preacher, it is so easy to take historical particularity and turn it into just a universal enlightenment message.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what that I know the card that you're talking about. That was what the message was attempting to do. And we do this all the time. We try, and it's a false notion, by the way, like in morality and natural law reasoning. It's a false notion that natural law reasoning gives us this neutral language with which to converse with the secular world. And so we don't import direct theological concepts into our moral debates with our contemporaries. And yet, I think as Christians, that's exactly what. Let's take the abortion thing, for example. We can develop natural law arguments as to why abortion is a bad thing. We'll set aside at all the debate about whether it should be legal or illegal. Let others debate. Obviously, I think it should be illegal, but you get my point
Sure.
is that's not my focus here. My focus is on the morality of it, immoral or moral. And you could come up with all these natural arguments. So I remember when I was there when John Paul II visited the United States for the first time. I was a young seminarian. And I remember that he gave a speech in which he said, human life is sacred from the very first moments of conception because it is the gift of a God whose love is infinite. And when this God gives life, it is forever. And in his Polish, it is forever, that great Polish accent he had. And I remember because as a young seminarian, I was all into, well, we have to develop these natural law arguments and we have to meet them with a sort of neutral language. And so otherwise, because not everybody buys the Jesus thing. But Pope John Paul cut right to the heart of it. Cut right to the heart of it. We oppose abortion because you're killing a being made in the image and likeness of God who has a dignity that is inviolate because of that image and likeness of God. And cut right to the chase. And we need
Yeah.
more. So we talk about the reduction of Christianity to a moralism, devoid of these supernatural aspects that come out in pilgrimages and so forth. And yet, even the moral aspects need that transformation from the gospel, even to remain moral. If you understand what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would say that abstract duty almost never convinces anyone. So it's one thing to say, I know abortion is wrong, but if it doesn't convince me, and this is my rhetorician coming out, if it doesn't convince me, then what good has it done for me morally? Like if I am intellectually convinced, but it doesn't move me to change my
Right.
action or move me to change my speech, then what good has that done for me morally? And
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Coming back to pilgrimage, it's this idea of the concrete moves us in a way that the abstract cannot.
That's right. That's a great way to put it. The concrete moves us in a way that the abstract cannot. And that doesn't mean that the abstract is unimportant. But something, as I always like to say, something has to breathe fire into those equations. Something
Right.
has to put flesh on those bones. Okay, we can see the skeleton, but it's not complete without the flesh. And the flesh is precisely that concrete reality. And so now, yeah, we're really, I think, getting down to the nitty gritty of why a pilgrimage spirituality is so important. It's not just to reinforce the sojourning pilgrimage aspect of our life that we're on a journey and all that because you can also then translate. I remember there was that movie about the Camino that had Martin Sheen in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hated that movie. I don't know what you thought about it, but I hate it. My wife likes it. She says, "Oh, just chill out. It is what it is. Take it for what it is." Blah blah. But I objected to it on the grounds that it seemed to me that the movie was trying to do just that, to simply to say, well, you don't have to believe in anything to get some benefit out of this because the journey is everything, and that kind of
Right.
stuff.
Right. And I haven't watched it, but isn't the whole point of the movie that he's scattering his son's ashes?
Yes, yes, and
So
that's
it's
beautiful. But
well,
yeah,
but I
but
mean,
and
in some way, it's an anti-pilgrimage, right?
exactly because it's
It's
it's getting rid of the concrete, right?
it's the dispersal of
Yeah,
relics. I mean, it's the
yeah,
getting rid of what you're actually making the Camino to go see.
yeah. So yeah, when I said it's beautiful, I meant his devotion to his son. He's doing this to
Right.
honor his son. But you're absolutely right. I had the same feeling. Like this is the church allows for cremation, but sort of. You know, it's still kind of frowned upon. I think anyway, it should be
Yeah.
frowned upon. Yeah, you're right. So he's dispersing the ashes to the four winds, and yet he's on this pilgrimage to something
To go see a
concrete.
body, to go see a body, in
Yeah,
particular, a
yeah,
body that is enshrined in a church.
yeah,
So the idea of the sacredness and the holiness of the body that will rise is the whole point of the Camino.
yeah.
I haven't done it. I have a brother-in-law who has, but I was there in Santiago de Compostela, and I got to pray in front of St. James for a good long time. It was a beautiful experience. But people who had made the Camino would walk in and just fall down in tears, right?
Yeah.
And that was so impressive to say they've reached a concrete destination. Enough with this foolishness about it's all about the journey. They
Yeah,
knew there was an aspect that it was about the destination.
that's
And when
right.
they got there, something changed. And it changed because here was, we believe, an apostle, right? An apostle who knew Jesus Christ that you've been walking to see. Like that's profound, man.
I would also, that is very profound. And before we're running, you know, we maybe few more, 10 more minutes, something like that. But uh, you mentioned the sort of the in scattering the ashes. It's kind of an anti-pilgrimage. I've also thought, you know, that when you pointed out that the sort of the destination is the goal, if there can't be, in some sense, a spiritual pilgrimage to places that are darker, that are actually manifestations of Antichrist, of evil. For example, I know people that have gone on spiritual pilgrimage to places like Auschwitz,
Mm.
and once there, use it as a means of prayer, you know, and praying for the dead, and praying that this never happens again, and praying for the victims and the transformation of the still living. And it strikes me that this is what Christ did. The light shone in the darkness, you know, and the darkness could not overcome it. Christ went into the very depths of evil in order to transform it from within. So I've often wondered too that for the truly spiritually more advanced, perhaps, or more adept, there can be a pilgrimage towards, not as a destination as such in itself towards evil, but with the eye towards, once there, attempting to transform it.
Sure, but we call it by a different word.
What do we call it?
Missionary work.
Yeah, okay, there you go. Yeah, yeah, that's true. Missional. I was thinking not so much though. I mean, missional in this. I always equate missional with evangelization, meeting the needs of local people in order to, you know, bring the gospel to them and so forth. But yeah, I guess you're absolutely right to actually go on pilgrimage to a site that you wish to, in a sense, even if it's to simply attempt to do reparation and therefore conversion through prayer at a site associated with evil. Yeah, that's missional.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Which points out that I would guess that there's a pilgrimage aspect to the missional.
Well, so, and I'll come back to that in just a second, but my spiritual father of blessed memory, Father Fred Miller, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was, yeah.
Dominican,
No,
right?
he was diocesan, but he
Oh,
did
okay. I'm
promote,
thinking of somebody else then.
yeah.
Right.
Um, he would mention to us a lot in preparing us for priesthood that we were successors to the apostles, that we had the same mission as the apostles, and that the apostles were sent to preach the word and drive out demons, and that those weren't two separate aspects, but that by preaching the word they drove out demons. That
Yeah.
there is a real advent of the kingdom of Christ that shatters the kingdom of darkness. And so, what I would argue, and it is really one of the theses of my book, is that pilgrimage is always prior to mission. That first you hear the call of Christ, come and see, you come and see, you're transformed, and after that transformation, you're then sent, right? To
So
go
there's
and
this,
bring
yeah,
that sacredness somewhere else.
that's interesting. I was thinking in a literary sense of the Lord of the Rings and Frodo's uh, missional, vocational trek journey to Mordor to throw the ring of power into Mount Doom and all that, and all the things that happened to him on the way there. I was thinking of that as a kind of pilgrimage in an own way, but it's not. You're absolutely right. It's something else. It's more of a missional thing than
Yeah,
a.
it's a journey with a mission. I mean, that's
And I,
that's literally what Frodo is. He
yeah,
has a mission.
yes, he does. Absolutely. One last question. One of the things a lot of people, I keep putting this microphone up, it's not working. A lot of the people listening to this have children. All right. And so the question that they might have would be, and I'm sure you've dealt with this because you run pilgrimages, how do we involve our children in a pilgrimage in a way that is appropriate to their age, but also does have meaning for them?
Sure. I think again, children correspond to the concrete. So, we've had children on our pilgrimages before, and they've experienced a lot in places like Fatima and Lourdes. It communicates on that childlike level.
Right.
There is a grasp of the imagination, and if anything, children are so much less skeptical of their imaginations that they're able to be moved more intensely. But I think it does matter then that you choose your pilgrimage sites appropriately, right? It has to be something because not every pilgrimage site is visually stunning. Okay. We went, one place we went on a past pilgrimage was where Venantius Fortunatus was buried. And it's like, okay, he's somewhere roughly under the floor here. And I think all his dust is all that remains. That's not going to grab a child, right? But Lourdes grabs a child. A great cathedral grabs a child. I'm using the wrong word here. Seizes the imagination of a child, right? Transforms them. And so, the other thing is that people with children often can't travel very far. So I think that, find a place that's local, that is visually stunning, that is, has, as the travelogues like to say, has atmosphere, right? That it
Yeah.
has, something that speaks on that subconscious level. Bring a child there, and they will experience it even more profoundly and immediately than you will.
That's exactly what I have seen actually happen many, many times, and it takes me aback every single time. And I reminded our Lord's words, "You must become like a child. You can't enter the kingdom of heaven." And what I've often tried to meditate, what did Christ mean when he said, my theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, who I did my doctoral work on, even wrote a little book, a little tiny book, which is a meditation on unless you become like a child. And so, yeah, I love when I'm at holy sites watching children that the parents have brought with them and see what their reactions are. And I think you're absolutely right, Father. Obviously, you know more about this than I do, but it's that concrete element in particular that really appeals to a child.
Right.
Yeah,
Yep.
very, very much so. They're mesmerized often by quite taken with it. Well, anyway, okay, we've been at this about an hour after we had some technical glitches at the beginning. I do apologize, especially to my audio only listeners, that my fancy pants microphone kicked out on me. So this is just, I've been using the microphone from my iMac. I don't know about you. How does it sound to you, Father? Sound all right?
Sounds great to me.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good to know. Maybe it's even better than my expensive microphone. Who knows? It's a new iMac. I don't know. But do you have any last words? Anything you'd like to say that I left out that I didn't?
Well, I think I'm obligated on a certain level to mention that I'm working with select international tours, and that we're building right now actually a program for pilgrim formation known as Stella Pellegrina, the Pilgrim Star. And we're going to be launching that in a couple of months to really have an actual, not just my book, but an actual formative program for all potential pilgrims to engage in these ideas, to be shaped by them so that there's pilgrimage can be something that they understand and something that's fruitful.
Well, that's great, and hopefully this will. I don't have a massive viewership. I'm not Matt Fradd, but my viewership is not insignificant. All right. And so I'm hoping that, yeah, that catches fire, because I would love to go on pilgrimage with you. You'd be like a great priest to be on pilgrimage with, I think. I think
Well,
you'd
I
be,
hope.
yeah. Well, just based on this brief, like hour and a half, or hour that I've been talking to you, you seem highly intelligent, highly educated, very theologically informed, sound, orthodox, yet would be also would know when to actually simply have a little fun, enjoy the locals, and a sense of humor, even, and so on. So, Father Clinton Sensat from the Diocese of Lafayette. Anybody interested in doing pilgrimages, get a hold of him. All right. All right. Well, thank you for joining me, Father, and thanks everybody for listening. And maybe we'll have Father back again someday to talk about a more recent pilgrimage or something along those lines. All right.
Great.
Thanks again, Father.
Thank you,
Bye bye.
Larry. Bye bye.